Okay, I guess we'll start. This is being recorded, so this will be put on the Circle site for the everyone that's on the Circle site. So um, just be aware that it's other people are going to see this as well. And what I'm trying to do here is to have a short conversation with those of you that want to. As much once a week if possible, but next week I'm in retreat. So, and then Roshi June and I are going on vacation in December. So this will probably be the last conversation for this year. But I wanted to have a conversation about this. The thing that Buddha says the most often is I teach suffering and the cessation of suffering. And I actually think that's a really important thing that he said and clarifies pretty much everything in terms of why we're here, why we're doing what we're doing, and what's the purpose of our practice. So that simple statement really clarifies our view, our intention, our direction, and the purpose. And the reason I say that is that if your goal is not the cessation of suffering, then you're going to settle for something less that comes along during your practice. It might be peace of mind, it might be less stress, it could be anything. There's lots of benefits from meditation. And if you aren't clear about the goal of the spiritual path, then you end up making the techniques you're using an end in themselves. And that is actually not helpful. So what we are doing here is we're exploring how we create suffering, and that there is a very clear path here that we are practicing for the ending of that suffering. And being aware of how we create suffering is very useful because we're just being honest about, we're not blaming other people, we're not trying to escape from suffering. We're actually acknowledging that we all suffer and how we create it. And then being very clear that what we are here to do is the cessation of suffering clarifies the whole reason why we're here in the first place. And when I first started this Zen Center back in, what was it, 2010, I was teaching, we still are, we're teaching mindfulness as a basis for the Zen path, but I was teaching it in a very secular way, and I could, because I'm psychologically oriented, I could see many benefits from mindfulness on many levels. And then over the years, as mindfulness has become more popular and more secularized, I've become increasingly dissatisfied with that approach because, well, I'm a Zen practitioner, and I think what's important is waking up. That's more important than being peaceful, for instance. So now I think we're teaching much more clearly that we're teaching mindfulness as a foundation for a Zen spiritual path of waking up, of waking up. So then the question is, well, so if we frame our practice in this saying, the Buddha says, I teach one thing only, suffering and the cessation of suffering, then that really clarifies everything. It takes all the confusion out of practice and makes it very clear what we're doing here. So and being aware of suffering is very useful because we can become complacent on a spiritual path too. So then the question is, how do we create suffering? And well, that's a big question, isn't it? I mean, there's a lot of things we could say, but essentially we view the world in a material way as forms that are separate from ourselves, and ourselves as separate from the world, and then we become isolated. And that's a big form of suffering. Anytime we create forms, objects, objects have edges and they rub together and they create conflict. Whether the objects are outside of ourselves or they're in our mind as an idea or a thought or an emotion, we create forms. And when we create forms, we create struggle. And that struggle, I think, is the nature of suffering. And rather than
directly with that suffering, in terms of how we're practicing, we avoid it by thinking we're missing something, we lack something. So there's something we have to do first. I have to strengthen my meditation. I have to have better samadhi. I have to read and understand the Heart Sutra first. Then I'll be over, then I'll, my struggle won't happen anymore. So we actually avoid the struggle by some prerequisite. And this is much like what we do with shame. But on the existential level, we do it as well. We say there's something I have to do first, and then you create a technique out of that, and that's what you settle for then as the end of your spiritual path, which is settling for, no, that's not the prize. Samadhi is not an end in itself, nor is meditation for that matter. Meditation is a practice for helping us to focus our be more intimate with the quality of our awareness and our attention, so that because it's that awareness that actually is without form. And that awareness doesn't discriminate. And it's the awareness that is free of the struggle, because the awareness doesn't need to do anything. But as long as we think we have to do something, we create tension, and then we create struggle. And so so that's the suffering side. And then one way to frame this that I think may help clarify it, we could substitute suffering and cessation of suffering with two other words, form and formless. And I think that can actually help clarify the arc of the spiritual journey. We believe that we're living in a world of forms. We objectify the world outside of ourselves. We solidify our own subjective experience as being solid in some way. And that's the way we create forms. And so the spiritual path is moving from a view we have of the world, which is very materialistic, because that's the culture we live in, towards a more subtle awareness. It's not based on forms. It's formless. It's a formless awareness. We say in Soto Zen, turn the light inward. So the practice is moving us towards letting go into an awareness that is not, it's not based on forms anymore. It's formless. It doesn't discriminate. It doesn't need to do anything. So again, one of the ways we can settle for less, and there's all kinds of stereotypes now in the culture about Zen. Zen is peace of mind, and I watch YouTube videos, and they always put that peaceful scene on. You have your Zen moment, and it's some beach in Honolulu somewhere. It looks very peaceful. People think, oh, that's Zen. That's not Zen. So we might think, oh, I just want to quiet my mind, but quiet is still situational. It's still related to forms. There have to be for me to have quiet, there have to be no noise around me. So it's conditional. But formless awareness is about stillness. And that stillness is not situational. And that's what I'm learning to trust through my practice, is that stillness, which doesn't need to do anything. And then the further, as we mature in this, I would say this formless awareness is what the sacred is. And the Christians call it, I think, something like the Holy Ghost, the Spirit. Now, the further subtlety is that this formless awareness exists freely with forms, or forms also exist here, but the formless awareness is very much present with the form. So we integrate the two together. But I think the movement, the arc of the spiritual path that we're on is moving towards letting go of all the ways we try to contrive reality, all the ways we try to solidify ourselves, because we start to notice that existence seems to be going on without us, doesn't need us. We're opening to a spaciousness which doesn't seem to need my opinion or my agenda or any of the things that I generally worry about that isolate me as a solid self. So I just wanted to open this up for some discussion, because I think it's very clarifying when you have a statement like this by the Buddha. I think it really clarifies everything. He did a lot of other teachings, obviously, the Four Noble Truths and the dependent origination and five skandhas, and he did a lot of the teachings, but the thing he said the most often was, I teach suffering and the cessation of suffering. And I think that's a very clear and helpful statement for all of us. So I'm going to stop talking and open it up to you for questions or comments. Anything that is coming up for you about this?
Yeah, I actually have a question or a comment or just maybe some thoughts. Like one thing that I kind of wonder about it, if the aim is waking up and kind of being able to drop back into an awareness of formlessness or emptiness, and just being able to do that again and again. I'm not sure I totally understand what the relationship of the sitting practice is to being able to do that, because sometimes they feel like they're almost orthogonal to one another, and it's not always clear to me why sitting for like long periods of time is actually even necessary, if really the practice is more about just kind of dropping back into that recognition of no self or emptiness or formlessness or non-duality, or however you want to put it.
It's a really good question, Dave. I think the spiritual path requires quite a bit of discipline, because we're creatures of habit. And so even though from the ultimate point of view, emptiness is already here, that's not something we're finding or discovering. It's already here, and we're simply having some insight into that what we call emptiness, which is essentially that nothing is self-existing by itself, right? Nothing. That's the teaching of emptiness. It's emptiness of self, or emptiness of self-existence, isolated self-existence. So I think meditation is a necessary. So you could say, from the ultimate point of view, there's no need to do anything like meditation. And the Pure Land tends to emphasize that more. They say there's no need to meditate because you're intrinsically awake. On the other hand, in fact, this was the question that Dogen had, because the teachings he was getting growing up was, we're intrinsically awake. So the question he had was, well, then why do we have to practice at all? And I think the practical answer to that is that we are creatures of habit, and we very easily slip back in to solidifying things in a way that creates struggle and suffering. And so when you're meditating, you're training. I think the two main methods for mindfulness are shamatha and vipassana. So I think that the beginning mindfulness begins with counting the breath, essentially. And that is a discipline of bringing yourself back and cutting through the speediness in the mind, because the mind left to its own devices without any discipline creates a lot of trouble. It starts thinking up all kinds of things. And so we're essentially at that level of practice, not practicing, not thinking, not giving rise to more thoughts, more stories, we're coming back to the present and being able to be present in an embodied way, I think is a very helpful quality of attention that we're training ourselves to do. And then once we establish that discipline of kind of landing on one dot, so to speak, with that precision that's necessary, that kind of discipline, then the discipline widens out much more to a meditation in everyday life through vipassana practice, where you're letting go of the count and you're just breathing and opening to space and relational awareness, and that becomes a much more contextual kind of awareness that's spacious and again, I think very helpful, because what you're really learning to do in meditation is to rest in the stillness. And you could do it, athletes talk about finding the still point when they're running. Runners can find that too, or an athlete can find it, and you could find it through hula or something else that you do. But I think because we are easily distracted, and I think meditation becomes very helpful. On the other hand, I would actually agree that meditation is not the end. It's not the point. Meditation is simply a way of training ourselves to pay attention with more clarity, I think. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that does make sense. Thanks.
Yeah. Pure Land doesn't emphasize meditation. They say we're already intrinsically awake, so why do you need to meditate? So that's valid as well. I mean, you could, but it seems hard for us to have this kind of quality of insight that really penetrates into what's here without having some kind of discipline to settle the mind and settle the body and show up here. So it's a good question, though. Anyone else? Linda, Yokozan.
Yeah, the part that is, well, not confusing, difficult for me is once you have this awareness, and this awareness that I don't really need to do anything. But at the point where I move out into the world, yes, I do have to do something. I do have to make a decision.
You do. So there's an integration of the formlessness with form, and that's the true teaching of non-duality. And that's why Zen is subtle, and I think actually a truly non-dual spiritual path, because there's no bias for the formless awareness. We're not saying that's the end point either. It's the integration of formlessness with the world, with form and functioning. So just because we have formless awareness doesn't mean we can't function and we can't be in the world, but we're in the world, but not of it, I would say. So there's a koan where someone's working hard in the monastery. Someone comes along and says, "Hey, it looks like you're working really hard." And the monk says, "Well, you should know there's one who's not working." So in that, and in fact, we do that kind of work in sesshin, in retreats. We do samu, which is a way of integrating the formless with the form, because it's usually some simple manual thing. It's not too complicated, but it allows us to be one with what we're doing and decrease the distance between ourselves and whatever that activity is. So if that distance gets decreased to the point where it's zero, then that's really truly intimate, the intimacy we are, I think, all longing for, to be really alive here in this moment. So yeah, we have to function. It's a big kind of Zen sickness in early Zen training. When people discover a student discovers emptiness, they think that's it, and there's nothing needs to function, and that's a trap. We call it a Zen sickness, actually. Someone is attached to they have some Kensho experience, some breakthrough, and they get attached to that, and then it becomes something where they're stuck. So in Zen, there's really nowhere to be stuck. There's nothing fixed. Everything is changing moment by moment. So the nature of emptiness is that the world is impermanent. Everything is changing, including us. So that's part of how we create suffering, is we want to solidify something here that confirms our own existence, because there's some fear of really letting go. So that, again, I think this statement is very helpful. It really clarifies, you stay close to how you create suffering, which is to be humble and honest. We all create suffering. Greed, anger, and ignorance, the three poisons. We do it, and it gets more subtle, perhaps, as we continue to practice. But I think then the question is, if it's a little crass to say the goal is cessation of suffering, because in a way that it's already here, right? The spiritual path isn't a linear progression to something you don't already have. It's a discovery of what's already here. But I think having that as a kind of I don't know what the word is, a kind of a goal, then you can ask the question: is what I am doing, is it contributing to less suffering? Is it decreasing suffering for myself and others around me, or is it increasing suffering? And then that gives you a way to kind of judge what you're doing constructive or not. And generally, in the Buddhist tradition, we would differentiate between wholesome and unwholesome states of mind or emotions or afflictions. So almost always the suffering in Buddhism is what's known as a klesha. It's usually an emotional, mental affliction of some kind, that we get attached to a point of view, an ideology, a dogma, or we get stuck in an emotion, and that then creates all the struggle that comes from that. Any other thoughts, questions? Yeah, I'll get to.
Yeah, I can get the idea of suffering, a cause of suffering being grasping or clinging, especially to what isn't. And how is that related to form and formlessness? Form seems more abstract. Yeah.
No, it's not abstract. It's actually pretty concrete. If you take something like the 4 foundations of mindfulness, which is a very elegant teaching of Buddha, of the arc of the spiritual path, you start with the body. Mindfulness, the first foundation is foundation of the body. So that's the home base. we start with the body, and then we start to really inquire into what is the body. And you begin to discover we have a kind of psychosomatic sense of our body. We have a thought about what our body is, which not actually isn't what it is. The body is mostly space. From the point of view of physics, our bodies aren't solid at all. But if you don't look at it with a eye of mindfulness and actually inquire into the nature of your body, it's easy to fool yourself into thinking that you're somehow solid, and then you keep trying to support that solidity, which creates more struggle. So the first foundation of mindfulness starts with the most basic form, the body, the most material form we're all very familiar with, right? We've all been incarnated into these particular bodies, and they are getting older, and they do get sick, and eventually we die, our bodies die. So that's actually explored in the first foundation of body. You start exploring. Some traditions say go into carnal grounds. You actually look at death and notice that don't avoid the reality of death and impermanence. The body that we think is so solid it's just going to be white bones eventually, right? So that's you start with form, and then the second foundation is you start looking at emotions, which is another way that we create form, but it's a little bit more subtle than the body. Now we're talking about emotions, and from the point of view of the Buddhist teachings, the emotions are either pleasure, painful, or neutral. So we're not going into the story behind the emotion. We're looking at the emotion at a very early point when it's triggered, whether it's pleasurable or painful. And we're noticing how we get attached to what's pleasurable and we push away what's painful. And that again creates more struggle. So then you start to notice, if you really work with emotions, you notice the emotions aren't solid either. They're very fleet. In fact, they're very ephemeral. There's nothing solid about emotions. And yet we hang on to them. We get attached to them very easily or push them away. But then the real inflection point is when you get to the third foundation of mindfulness. And by the way, the language Buddha uses for all of these four foundations is really wonderful. He talks about the body in the body, feelings in the feeling. There's this sense of intimacy about how we're working with this. But when you get to the foundation of mind, how do you look at mind? You can't. The mind is not an object anymore. It's not a form. It's formless. And that right there is the inflection point where you start to notice that up to this point, your practice was full of, your willpower and your determination was important to keep going. But now it's you're getting in the way. Your willpower is actually getting in the way of your practice. And there's to have foundation, to look at the mind, you have to let go. The mind, you can't find the mind anywhere. It's not a form, it's a formless awareness. It's actually the awareness itself. And so you discover there is this, it's necessary to let go of all the things you have been acquiring and hanging on to. And now the spiritual path is a different kind of, in the beginning, you're working with all the mechanics of it, the posture, the breathing and all that. But now you've integrated that, you've internalized that, like it's like brushing your teeth, meditation is. You don't think about it much anymore. So now the path to the cessation of suffering is really letting go. And what you're letting go of is all the various kinds of ways we talk about form. You're letting go of thoughts, you're letting go of your attachment to emotions, you're letting go of the world outside of yourself that you've been objectifying, and you're letting go of yourself as a solid form. And I think that's the beginning of this sense of, we begin to trust the formless awareness that we can't, it's more subtle. And then the final foundation of mindfulness of dharmas, is now again reintegrating form back into the formless, so that you now can have this formless awareness in your daily life and function and go to work and feed your kids and do all the things we need to do. But there's no struggle in that anymore. It's just you do what you need to do. And there's not so much effort in it in the way that there might have been before. It's a kind of effortless effort. And what comes with that is a lot of wholesome qualities of joy, gratitude, and that comes from discipline, surprisingly. We usually don't associate discipline with joy. But in the Buddhist tradition, we say all these wholesome qualities are, in a way, they're transcendent, in the sense that they're already here. There's not a how-to manual about how to let go. No one can really tell us how to do that. You have to kind of figure it out for yourself. You're given a map, but the map isn't the territory. You got to read the map, and the map is helpful. It gives you a context of, whether you're on the path or you're not. But past that, it's really up to each of us to figure it out. So I think that the foundation of mindfulness is a really good example of the movement from very form to more subtle forms, and finally to formless awareness, which is really the awareness itself doesn't discriminate. The awareness itself isn't, it's not separate from, there's no boundary in this awareness. There's no division. So we come full circle. We come back to the wholeness. We've always been whole. We've distracted ourselves. We've been misperceiving who we are, or misperceiving reality. And we come full circle in the spiritual path and rediscover what's always been here. But somehow, practically speaking, there does need to be a kind of a goal that keeps us on the path. That's a kind of a conditional thing. It's kind of like the Lotus Sutra has all these upayas, and skillful means are ways of kind of tricking ourselves into being bodhisattvas or being on the path, because we're easily deceived. And so we do need, technique is a kind of a gross word, but we need skillful means to remember who we actually are, remind ourselves. In fact, the word mindfulness actually means to remember what's important, I think.
Thank you.
Anything else? Michaela, how you doing? You're muted, Michaela.
Yeah, there's a lot to digest here and
Yeah.
consider, and so it's been great though.
Okay. So that's probably enough for one discussion. We could be happy to continue this. If you have questions and you want to bring them up on the circle site, we can continue the discussion. Any final thoughts before we close? I'm also recording this so you can go back and look at it if you want. But I think this saying of the Buddha is often overlooked, and I think it's really maybe the most important thing that he said, because it just clarifies everything. It gets rid of all the confusion. It makes it very clear what we're doing here and why we're doing it. We're here to wake up. To discover who we really are. And then we all long for this wholeness, to not be separate, to to be one with everything, to be a part of the planet, not to be a spectator. Yeah. Okay. All right. Thank you.